Hello, folks, and welcome back to Mental Health, the podcast where we discuss the latest tools, cutting-edge research, and ancient practices to help you take back control of your emotional well-being. This is part 2 in our month-long 4-part deep dive on the topic of depression. So if you missed last week's episode, I really encourage you to go back and check that one out first. It sets a lot of the context for what we're going to be talking about today and will be really helpful, I think, to kind of lay a bit of a foundation and build up your own knowledge of what is depression, how does it work, what's going on, a little bit of science just to kind of explain and put a little bit of context behind why do you feel the way you do? Like, what are the mechanisms involved that make that a reality? I'm not a science guy. Like, you probably just heard me stumble my way through that little bit of science there. I'm like, blah, 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 blah. But the more I get to know Steve and the more research I do myself into my own depression and what causes it and what affects it, the more everything starts to fall into place, the more motivation I have to do some of the practices that we cover, the more insight I have into what makes me tick and what doesn't make me tick. And so that's just a big plug just to go back and check out a free episode we did last week. That's how much we care about it. We're trying to sell it really hard. I should probably sell it a little bit less. But it's there. It's on Spotify. It's wherever you get your podcasts. And other than that, I'm just going to get out of the way here and jump straight into part 2, where we are covering the causes. We're covering some of the cures and really getting into this idea of a chemical imbalance and exploring what does that even mean? And is it relevant? Is it useful? Or is it maybe something that has been picked up by marketers and ran with a million miles an hour? But hey, don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. Thanks for being here and really hope that you enjoy. Okay, cool. So that makes a lot of sense. And I know like one of the big cases you've made throughout your career is this idea that depression is a disease of civilization, which is pithy and brilliant and terrifying and a wonderful TEDx title if anyone was ever to use that and get a few million views on YouTube, you know. But like, so
hey, I see what you're doing there. Thank you. I love that.
So
shout out.
You know, I guess like this is the deep dive. This is the podcast. Like, talk to us or walk us through, like, how do these lifestyle changes actually lead to depression in the brain? Like, it's the $1 million question, Steve. Like, here we go. Yeah. Like, what actually causes depression? I get that sitting in my podcast studio chair for 8 hours a day is bad for my mental health, but, like, actually unravel the systems that make that so.
Yeah, wow. All right, so first things first, let me just get this out there. Depression is probably best thought of as like this web. If you maybe you want to picture in your mind a spider web or something with these multiple interwoven threads of different levels of causation at different levels of analysis or complexity. So let's unpack it. So we've got the genetic level, we've got the neurochemical level, we've got the hormonal level, we've got cognitive, how we think, affective, how we feel, behavioral, social, environmental, they're all interwoven. And just like in a spider web, you pluck on one thread and the whole web vibrates. It's like that with depression. You can make a tweak, let's say at a neurochemical level, and it ripples through the whole system. You can make a tweak at the behavioral level. Maybe you get somebody's body moving and it ripples through the entire system with changes all the way down through the system and up through the system. And so, well, that sounds like a scholar, right? It sounds like an academic saying, look,
it's almost like he's a professor.
I know. And I just, you know what? I'm just going to own it. It's like, look, there is no simple answer to what causes depression. It is multiple causality. And to make it even more interesting, but maybe also even a little bit more confusing, what causes depression for one person may not be exactly what causes depression for another person, but they wind up with a very similar sort of final common pathway. So let's see if we can unpack it, okay? I know that that's a lot of abstraction, and I want to make this really, really concrete.
Yeah, but like, I mean, it makes sense what you're saying, because if there was one simple cause, then in theory there would be one simple cure. And
exactly,
you know, I know your book is called The Depression Cure, and in that book, it's not like it's like one chapter, take this one pill to sort out your chemical imbalance and your life will change forever. But I'm cart before the horse there. I'm unintentionally going to trigger you, so I'm just going to stop talking.
No, that's no, I love it. And yeah, I mean, one of the I guess one of my hobby horses is like, look, we all want the magic bullet. Yeah. We all want the golden pill that's going to be I mean, it's human nature. We crave that simplicity and that elegance of,
and
like,
then they all lived happily ever after. It's just
absolutely. Yeah. And, look, for some things that people really care about, the history of medicine is filled with the occasional miracle pill, right? If you think about, like, when the first antibiotics were introduced, I mean, they were miraculous. They were game changing. They took diseases like tuberculosis that were killing hundreds of thousands of, maybe millions of people a year, and rendered them largely benign. And so that's the template that we have in our head. We want the miracle drug. I think U2, the band U2, right? Hey, they're from your neck of the woods, right? Sort of, kind of down the road.
You know, just Bono's Irish. We'll go with that.
Okay, well, yeah, I know. All right, forget I said anything. But the band U2, you might have heard of them. They had a song called "Miracle Drug," right? Where it's like, we want the miracle drug or the miracle therapy or the miracle, whatever. And sadly, in depression, it doesn't typically work that way. And of course, we're going to get to that in part 2. But right now we're talking about, well, what causes depression? Similar kind of deal. But let me say this. There's a landmark study that's had a profound influence on my career that showed that if you look at people the very first time they have a clinical depressive episode, the very first episode, and some people, fortunately, only ever have one. We know that's about 1 out of 5 people who get depressed. So about 1 out of every 5 people who get depressed, it's only ever the one episode. But most people will have multiple episodes. They will come back. We'll return to that point. If you look at people the first time they get depressed, the vast majority of them have had some sort of painful life event or multiple painful life events that happened right before the depression. So, what are we talking about? Like a horrible breakup, like losing a loved one, like moving across the country, like getting fired from your job, like not getting into school, like, failing out of a program, that kind of thing. And so what we know is the first time somebody gets depressed, it's like over 90% of the time, lots of painful things have been happening. And so that gives us a really big clue. Now, really quick caveat. When somebody gets depressed for the second or third or fourth time, about half of those recurrent episodes seem to come out of the blue, where the person's like, I don't even understand why I'm getting depressed right now. Like, there's nothing particularly unusual going on.
So it's almost like once that part of your brain has woken up, and this is extremely non-scientific stuff that I'm about to say, but it's almost like, there's like ruts formed in your brain, and it's just a lot easier for your brain to fall back into that rut once it's kind of been dug out. There's a few mixed metaphors. Take whatever one you want.
Oh, dude, I think you've got about 3 or 4 going on. How about this? When I was 12, I sprained my left ankle, pretty badly, and it healed beautifully, but it is more likely to get sprained again.
There you go.
Right. So if I'm on the basketball court and I step on somebody's sneaker, the ligaments, the tendons, they don't have quite as much resilience, right, as an ankle that's never been put through that kind of strain. So the depressed brain, after it heals, it is more vulnerable to snapping back into that depressive mode of functioning, which is one of the reasons, by the way, why so much of my focus with my own patients has been not just getting them well. Now, and that's hugely important, right? When somebody's suffering from the debilitation and the pain and the agony of depression, absolutely, job one is to get them better. But we never, ever leave it at that because, in the back of my mind, it's always like, hey, if we don't make massive overhauls for most patients' lives to put in place a whole array of protective practices, then they're vulnerable. And there's a very, very high likelihood that they're going to get depressed again. Okay. So what does a painful life event do? How do you get from like, oh, I'm going through this horrible breakup to, I'm in this state of debilitating depression? Well, one of the most important pathways has to do with the brain's stress circuitry. And we talked about that a lot in previous episodes, the fight or flight or freeze response, right? When the hardwired reaction to deal with threatening events, to deal with things that require us to mobilize to address these really threatening things. Well, we have a stress response system in the brain, and it is designed under most circumstances just to go off for a very short period of time. And unfortunately, in the modern world, for a lot of people, that stress response circuit in the brain, and it ripples through the body, the part of the body that runs on adrenaline and so forth, that circuit gets stuck in the on position, which is super toxic. And after a few weeks of being stuck in the on position, many people's brains and bodies just shut down. They interpret that as like, holy crap, like this is like some sort of sign that there's massive physical illness happening. And the brain flips into sickness mode, where it interprets that runaway stress response as like, oh my God, this is like having a horrible infectious illness. Let's shut everything down. Let's withdraw. Let's crawl into some black cave somewhere and just lick our wounds until this thing lifts. And we can obviously see the connections between that kind of sickness behavior and depressive behavior.
I mean, it was one of the most helpful things that you've ever said. I don't even know where I picked it up first, but this idea that, depression mimics really severe illness in terms of wanting, like encouraging you to withdraw socially, encouraging you to like, quote unquote, stay in bed all day. And I was like, oh my goodness. And I think he also said something like, in the case of like severe sickness, that's exactly what you should do. In the case of depression, you should almost try to do the opposite. But again, we'll get there.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's a beautiful adaptation if we're fighting, a horrible case of the flu or, any kind of infectious illness, because in part it protects our loved ones. And when we're really sick, we do have a kind of a feeling like, yeah, I really don't want to spread this contagion to the rest of the tribe. The depressed brain thinks exactly the same thing. People in the grip of depression generally don't want to be around anybody. But in this case, it's a completely false, and it turns out to be a really pathological signal, because the worst thing in the world we can do when we're clinically depressed is shut down. That actually makes it worse. The worst thing we can do is withdraw socially. That makes it worse. That sustains it. And so, yeah, part of the beauty of treating depression is validating for people what they're experiencing, but then gently encouraging them and saying, yeah, what your brain is telling you right now is actually not for your own good. It feels like it is, but it's really not. We really, really have to resist it. Now, along with that illness response, one of the big things that happens when we're physically sick is we have inflammation. And everybody's heard of inflammation. We've talked about it a bit before on the pod. Basically, inflammation is just a part of our immune response that mobilizes to heal damaged tissue and to fight off invading pathogens, bacteria, viruses, and so forth. So, I mean, we need inflammation. We absolutely could not live without an inflammatory response. The problem is that when inflammation goes on for a long period of time at high levels, it pushes the brain into sickness mode. And so, to a first approximation, the chronically inflamed brain is a depressed brain. So anything that pushes inflammation higher has the potential to make us depressed. The inflamed brain is typically a depressed brain. So, well, let's think about this. The modern diet, which is filled with ultra-processed foods, very inflammatory. When people have a disrupted microbiome, the community of microbes in the gut, we've talked about that before. We're going to have a whole episode coming up at some point fairly soon. Well, guess what? A person with disrupted gut microbes has tons of inflammation, and it can actually push them into depression. If a person is sedentary, they're more likely to have inflammation. So, I mean, it's inflammation. When people talk about chemical imbalance and depression, I know they're talking about the brain chemicals that are targets of most of the medication that we have. But when I think about chemical imbalance, I'm not thinking about any of that stuff because I don't think it's the most important types of chemical imbalance, although it's good, pretty good marketing for drug companies. I think about things like stress hormones and inflammatory hormones because those turn out to be way more important for many depressed patients.
Crazy. Yeah, this is starting to all kind of come together for me. Like you said, something really beautiful in Anxiety 101 that we dropped a few weeks ago. We said something like, if a person's anxiety levels are caused by hormonal changes, then all the CBT therapy in the world won't help them. And just hearing you speak, if you have inflammation-induced depression, then one of the only ways to really address that is to get in and develop some sort of anti-inflammatory regime, or whatever that looks like. And I guess we can get into that in part 2. But yeah, it's interesting to see how each of these threads are going to have a slightly bespoke treatment plan, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, just to riff off that just for a second, because I think this might be really validating for some people. So somebody might be listening to that and think well, okay, so what if I have neuroinflammation and I do cognitive behavioral therapy, right? I learn how to identify the horrible negative, the horribly biased negative thinking that happens in depression, learn how to cut off the downward vicious spiral of negative thinking and its connection with negative emotion. Is that not going to work? And it turns out that people who successfully complete cognitive therapy for depression, it has an effect of turning down their runaway stress response. And that makes sense, right? If we're not ruminating, if we're not dwelling on negative thoughts all the time, if we learn how to interrupt that spiral of rumination, then it turns down the brain's runaway stress response. And guess what? If we turn down stress hormones, that has a ripple effect of turning down inflammatory hormones. So believe it or not, just going through a successful course of cognitive therapy, for some people, it's not the most efficient way of doing it, right? It's way less efficient than doing something directly anti-inflammatory, but it can have indirect beneficial inflammatory effects on it. Yeah. So it's all
web, bro. The spider's
exactly.
Web.
Oh,
so real.
Hey, you just are you familiar with the phrase "you stole my thunder"?
Hey, it's what we podcast hosts do for a living.
Oh. Hey, I guess it's good work if you can get it. Anyway, yes, thank you for that. The spider's web. Okay, let's talk about something else that might really be not on people's radar, but one of the big causes of depression for some people has to do with disruptions, dysregulation in their body clock. The body clock. Yes, we really do have a body clock buried deep in the center of the brain. If you're keeping score at home, it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. It's embedded in a very primitive part of the brain called the hypothalamus. We have a body clock, and it regulates so-called circadian rhythms, or the sort of 24-hour cycle that regulates things like our arousal level, but maybe more importantly, our sleep wake cycle, our hormone levels, our alertness. I mean, so many different things. And guess what? People who have clinical depression very often have a body clock that is out of sync, and that messes with their sleep profoundly. The typical patient with depression, by the way, has a phase shift in their circadian rhythms, which is a fancy way of saying their body clock is messed up by a couple hours. Usually it's advanced by a couple hours. So they're waking up a couple hours early. Say if their target wake up time is 7 a.m., they might be wide awake at 4 a.m., 5 a.m., and they can't get back to sleep. And, this, we all know how it can affect our mood and lots of other things when we're not sleeping well. If you want to get a lab rat clinically depressed, you can just start messing with its sleep. And it turns out, in fact, if you start depriving the lab rat of just one type of sleep, we call it, it's the deepest phase of sleep, slow wave sleep, delta wave sleep, stage 3, stage 4 sleep. They're all kind of synonymous. Non-REM sleep is another synonym for this. If you start disrupting and depriving the rat just of that phase of sleep, you can make it clinically depressed within a week or two. And get this, the spider's web. When we go to sleep and we are stressed out, if we have high levels of stress hormones, it actually tells the brain's sleep circuitry, hey, don't go into really deep sleep because apparently we're under threat. There's danger. Don't get deeply asleep. Just
what if the
keep it
wolves
light.
come and start raiding our camp?
Yes,
You've got to be able to spring up immediately and sort that.
Yeah, so you better wake up like every half hour or so. You better stay really restless and light sleep, and don't ever take the risk of getting into that super deep sleep where it's going to be hard to wake up, where you might not hear the twigs, the branches breaking while the wolves are sneaking up on us, right?
I mean, it also explains to me why, like, some people say after, bringing a newborn home to the house, like, you can get in a real funky kind of state of mind.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, I mean, it actually reminds me, I was in a stage, like so many new parents, of just horrific sleep deprivation. First 2-3 months after our daughter, Abby, was born, she really had a lot of trouble the first couple months of her life with sleep continuity. She was awake all the time. So we were awake all the time. And after a couple of months of sleep deprivation, I remember just driving through this beautiful vista. This was in Boulder, Colorado, and seeing the spectacular scene in the mountains and just feeling nothing. Just
whatever, dude, this sucks.
Oh my God. It was probably the most striking experience of anhedonia, that inability to experience pleasure. Now, I wasn't clinically depressed, but that kind of chronic sleep deprivation had left me in a state where my brain's reward circuits, pleasure circuits even, were not responding the way they would typically respond, right? So if you want to disrupt somebody's normal neural functioning, just mess with their sleep for a long period of time. And yet this is what happens for so many people with depression.
Are you happy if I do a little complete rabbit hole interruption before we move on to the next cause?
Absolutely.
Okay. Do you know the origin of stole my thunder, or if someone steals your thunder?
No.
Okay.
No, but please do tell.
I promise it'll be 30 seconds, okay? I can't remember the guy's name, but he was like some sort of a playwright, and he had this thing called a thunder machine, which was basically a big tin sheet, like picture like corrugated iron. And so like anytime on stage you would need some thunder, they'd have people in the back like banging this thunder machine. And then I think like literally the day after he debuted this, he went and saw somebody else's play, and they had made the exact same thunder machine. And then he's quoted as saying, "Hey, you stole my thunder!"
Oh, I feel so completed now. This is thank you for that.
So there you go.
Yeah, you know what, folks? You never know what the hell you're going to hear about on the Mental Health Pod, but it's usually going to be pretty illuminating, hopefully a little entertaining. All right, we're talking about, okay, what are some of the main things that cause depression? So we've talked about painful life events, we've talked about stress hormones, we've talked about inflammation, we've talked about sleep, we've talked about circadian rhythms. Let me just say a little something more about hormones, because not only do we have imbalance in stress hormones like cortisol, like adrenaline, but we also have hormonal disruption in reproductive hormones like testosterone. Turns out testosterone is a really powerful antidepressant, anti-anxiety hormone for both men and women. And when we're really stressed out, testosterone levels tend to plummet. Did you know that? When we don't get enough sleep, testosterone levels tend to plummet. When we eat like crap and we don't get enough healthy fats in our diet, testosterone levels tend to plummet. When we don't get enough dietary zinc from whole foods, testosterone levels plummet. So that's interesting. What about more characteristically feminine reproductive hormones like estrogen and progesterone? Well, we've talked about a progesterone derivative called allopregnanolone. I know it's a mouthful, but man, it's been discovered that allopregnanolone is a natural anti-anxiety, antidepressant hormone, and it tends to preferentially protect women from the ravages of anxiety and depression. But guess what? When somebody goes on hormonal birth control, it can mess with their progesterone, allopregnanolone levels. And some people get depressed right after going on hormonal birth control. Now, it can go the opposite way. Some people have their depression get better depending on how their body's reacting to that specific formulation. But it's just worth putting out there that there are lots of, I think, under the radar, sneaky hormonal influences on depression that people really need to put on the radar, especially if they notice that their depression had its onset after they had some sort of obvious hormonal change, because hormones have a profound effect on the brain.
So does this, and I know we could probably spend 3 hours talking about this corner of the spider's web, but does this kind of allude to why one of the common things with like severe levels of anxiety and depression is a loss of sex drive? I know we've talked about anhedonia, and I know we've talked about the sickness kind of withdrawal mode of the brain, and it makes sense evolutionary. You know, if you're really sick, you want to pause the reproduction kind of drive for a while to get yourself back into tip-top shape, but the hormonal change, I imagine, would have a big impact on that as well.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Absolutely. When people are clinically depressed, their testosterone levels plummet often, and we know that testosterone has a profound impact on sex drive for men and women, because women, of course, have testosterone as well, just at lower levels. But the spider's web is even more complex. Why? Because there are these brain chemicals, right? And we've alluded to them before, serotonin, dopamine, and so forth. Well, guess what? Dopamine, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, is the major neurotransmitter in the brain's reward circuits, our motivational circuits, our pleasure circuits. So dopamine-based reward does get compromised in depression. And so people, not only do they have lower sex drive, but they very often enjoy sex less because they're enjoying everything less. And that can also influence sex drive. So I don't want to give completely short shrift to the role of circuits in the brain that use dopamine, the role of circuits that use serotonin. I just feel like they've been wildly overemphasized, given their relative importance. They are important. They're just not the most important. People know about them more because of, I would say, because of big pharma marketing rather than because of their scientific role per se.
Makes sense. You know, like we've said before, it's the low-hanging fruit. People want an easy solution. They want to see, this is the problem, this is how you solve it. You know, this is the nail, this is the hammer. Let's just get this thing done so I can get back to living my life. And so, you know, you also understand why these things have spread so quickly because it's convenient and it's easy, and we long for solutions like that, you know.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's completely understandable. And yet, as we're going to see when we talk about treatment, when people latch on to the I have a chemical imbalance sort of framing, it can have some really unhelpful consequences that I think have led so many millions of people into a dead end. When it comes to having sustained recovery. And so we'll return to that. Okay.
But this is where you kind of step in as being quite, I'm going to use the term countercultural in the field.
Sure,
I am. With your last cause here, because it's really the opposite of the chemical imbalance, you know, and this is kind of like what I know you to hang your hat on. So you know, it says here in front of us, like the last cause is lifestyle. And then just that, again, that amazing pithy kind of line where it's like depression is a disease of civilization. So unpack that for us if you can do so in under 5 PhDs.
Oh, it's too much pressure, man. Yeah. Well, so here's the irony. Everything that we do with our bodies changes our brain chemistry, right? So it's not like I would juxtapose brain chemistry and lifestyle and say, oh, these are two completely opposite things. It's like, no, they're all part of the same tapestry. They're woven together. It's like, look, if we change how we eat, that changes our brain chemistry. If we change our level of physical activity, again, ditto, changes brain chemistry. If we change how much sunlight we're getting, changes brain chemistry. Light is a drug that hits the retina, right? So all of these things are interconnected. It just turns out that the way we are living, that sedentary, indoor, socially isolated, fast food laden, screen addicted pace of 21st century life, it is just really, really psychologically and neurologically toxic. And so it does turn out that the way we are living is actually driving an epidemic of clinical depression. And I think the sooner we recognize that, the sooner we're going to be able to actually move the needle. Because guess what? There's been a 300% increase in antidepressant drug use just in the last couple decades. It's a threefold increase. And guess how much it's moved the needle on the societal burden of depression? The answer, 0. Ooh. In fact, the societal burden of depression has increased while we've been throwing mountains of drugs at the problem. Why? Because we've been throwing mountains of drugs at the problem with the false sense of security that, oh, that's going to fix it. Surely that's going to fix it. Chemical imbalance, let's throw chemicals at it. Again, I'm not here to bash the meds. My full disclosure, my wife is a brilliant psycho.
I thought you were going to say, full disclosure, I'm going to do that in part 2.
Oh my God, no. Full disclosure, my wife is a psychiatric med expert. She's good at it. She's helped lots and lots of her patients with psych meds. They can sometimes be quite helpful. It's just that they don't lead to a lasting cure for the majority. And we just have to be honest about that so that we can be sufficiently motivated to do what's really necessary to get people well and keep them well.
Okay. So my, I don't know what to call it, my listener spidey sense here is like the alarm bells going off, because I realized we're coming to the end of part 1 and I'm like, dude, we gotta inject a little bit of hope here at the end.
Okay.
We've been laying out honest stuff. This is great, but I imagine, as someone who's been through depression many, many times, if I've clicked onto this episode kind of in a bit of a crisis point, and I want to know, does it get better? Is there a cure? Is there a way that we can get around this? With drugs, without drugs? I know we're going to talk about treatments, but you've dealt with a lot of patients throughout your career. You're swimming in deep with all of the research. You have a lot of anecdotal stories coming your way. Give us a little bit of hope here, just before we move into the second part.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm really glad you raised that, because when people are in the grip of depression, because of the negativity bias, because of it's like pulling really, really black shades over our field of vision, and the world feels gray and bleak and muted. Feels like it's never going to get better. And thank God, the overwhelming majority of cases of depression do lift. And so there's always reason for hope. But beyond that, what I would say is there's hope not just for recovery, but for staying well. The issue is that if we only throw drugs at it, or if we only do a short-term round of psychotherapy to get well, and we do nothing else to change our life, our odds of staying well are not awesome. Most people will get depressed again. And so, I would say, back to your question, Hugh, yes, it is possible for depression to be completely cured. But here's the analogy I like to make. So imagine somebody has what we call adult onset or type 2 diabetes, right? So their blood sugar gets dangerously high a lot, and it has some really, really horrible health consequences. So if somebody finds out they've got type 2 diabetes, it's like, all right, well, we could throw drugs at it, but it turns out that if you are willing to change your life a bit, if you're willing to eat the kind of food that don't spike your blood sugar, so, we call it a low glycemic load diet, and you're willing to get physically active, to, have some regular activity, and that could just be take a brisk walk for 45 minutes to an hour a day, and you're willing to work on weight management, because we know that obesity can make diabetes a lot worse. So if you're willing to make some simple changes and be vigilant for a lifetime, the vast majority of people with type 2 diabetes can stay in remission. They can basically get out of that diabetic state. They can stay in remission for a lifetime. But notice the caveat, notice the disclaimer. They've got to basically treat it as okay, I'm in remission, but I'm still vulnerable, so I can't really relax my guard. I've got to keep my guard up. I've got to make this a lifelong commitment to living a healthy lifestyle and doing all the things. Now, the one difference with depression, it's very similar to that. The difference is that the diabetic usually doesn't have like a random challenge where it's like, hey, guess what? You're going to be drinking a 6-pack of Pepsi right now. Just randomly, you have no control over it. But with depression, life will sometimes throw a challenge at our brains, right? Life will sometimes be like, okay, well, now you have this viral infection and you're going to have inflammation because you have the flu or you have COVID or you have, whatever. And so the person who's in recovery from depression is going to occasionally have something happen. Maybe, it could be a really stressful life event or something where it's like, okay, now here's a challenge. And if you don't have lots of those things in place, it could take you all the way back down to the bottom of the mountain, like a snowball that just starts rolling. And now the person's back in the depths of despair. But if they have those protective things in place, then instead of being another full-blown episode, it's like, oh yeah, I had kind of a rough week. But thank God it did not become a full-blown episode again. And that's really, I think, the most realistic picture of somebody with depression moving forward. They can be cured, but the cure is always going to feel like a work in progress.
And like just to build on that slightly, I said at the top of every single show, like depression is something that I've been dealing with since I was 11. And actually, off the back of one of the causes you mentioned there, inflammation, I had a very severe virus of a kind, and that seemed to kick me into some sort of post-viral thing. And so I totally resonate with a lot of stuff you were saying there about inflammation, and still a trigger of mine to this day is, after being sick and that inflammatory response is working hard, I got to be real careful. And I've noticed a lot of kind of episodes would come off the back of that. But this idea that, you can feel like you're back to square one, but if I look at the trend over the last, say, 15 years in my life, it is one that trends upwards. And it's like one of those graphs. This is like an old primary school or elementary school kind of metaphor here. But, it's like the classic, the route to success is never a straight line, and
yes,
absolutely. The curve may be going up, but it's a lot of bumps and ups and downs along the way. And like my own personal experience with this as someone who is still in the arena and has done a lot of fighting and has a lot more fighting to do, you over time start to pick up more and more tools. You start to get more and more knowledge that helps you, more and more things on your mental health tool belt, as we often say on the show, to basically use whenever, these hard times in your life come. And the really encouraging thing is, like in my story and the story of so many people that I know, is while the episodes are still incredibly painful, they don't last even half as long as they used to when I was a teenager. And while they still feel incredibly dark, they're nowhere near as dark as they used to be. And so I take incredible hope, even in my own story, of looking at where I have come from, where I am now, and then that just gives me hope for the future of where I'm going as well. So, I don't know what state you are listening to this episode in, but we do just really want to end this episode on the fact that there is genuine hope. The battle is not necessarily easy. In fact, it's more like a war. It's multiple battles over the course of a life for many of us, but you do get tougher, you do get more allies on side, you do get more weapons and tools and things that you can kind of have along with you in this journey. And it is a journey, and there are going to be highs, there are going to be lows, and the fact is, and the important thing is just to keep on walking. And the longer I walk, in my own experience, the better it gets and the easier it becomes. And so I just have to have that hope for the future as well.
Absolutely. And one thing we know is that the longer the brain is in a state of non-depression, the longer the brain is in a state of healthy functioning, the more those depressive circuits will heal, and the depressive mode of functioning will decay and weaken. So basically what that means is the longer we stay out of depression, the less likely it is that we'll ever go back into that state. And then even if events conspire to push us in that direction, Hugh, just like you said, it's like, okay, well, I may be pushed back in that direction by this virus, by this painful event or whatever, but it doesn't mean that I'm going all the way back down to the bottom of the mountain, right? So, I mean, we don't even diagnose a depressive episode until it lasts at least 2 weeks, where all these symptoms are happening at a high level every day. And, so many people that I've known who have really put these protective habits into place in their life after several years of recovery, when they start to go back into an episode of depression, it's much more mild, just as you said, and it doesn't actually get to that diagnostic level. Again, it's like this is kind of scary, and it's definitely attention grabbing. But they have these tools that they know how to bring out and how to arrest that downward slide, and then how to allow the brain to get back in that healthy mode again.
Awesome. Well, that's exactly what we'll be getting into next time, where we cover a lot of the treatments. We're going to talk about drugs. We're going to talk about short-term things you can deploy if you're in the middle of a crisis right now. And then we're going to talk a lot about that long game that Steve was talking about earlier, where how can we live a life? Oh my goodness. How can we change our lives in such a way that we are living a lifestyle that is antidepressant by nature? But I guess we'll get into that when we get into that. Thanks for today, Steve, and look forward to chatting to you next time. Great stuff. Wow. That is where we are going to end part 2. I'm just looking at like what's coming up next. I'm like, oh yeah. I don't know how much I should give away at this point. It's like, do you give it all or do you like wait for next time? But what I can tell you is that next week, the third part in our series, we will be going and diving deep into a lot of the tools, a lot of the treatments, and a lot of the actionable steps. How do you like that for a buzzword? The actionable steps you can take to feel better right now. That sounds like an absolute snake oil salesman pitch, but we're covering short-term break glass in case of emergency strategies, things that you can do in the moment, in the middle of a crisis, to give yourself that little bit of an uplift, get your head above the water, to pursue some more of those long-term strategies that we're going to cover in the 4th episode, in the final part of this series. So we're also going to talk about drugs, which, you know, is one of Steve's favorite subjects. He knows a lot of the science involved in that. I was fascinated. My mind is absolutely blown, and we really look forward to sharing that with you. So, yeah. Other than that, I just want to say big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters for making this episode possible, and indeed this series possible. And look, let's just go for it, making this show possible. It is because of people just like you who support this podcast for as little of a price of a cup of coffee. What was I trying to say there? As little as, it was the word as little as the price of a cup of coffee every single month. And, you know, we're a small show. We are independent. We're ad-free. We could run a whole bunch of ads on this show. We don't feel like it's appropriate to do so. We also just hate ads in general. As a listener, I don't enjoy sitting through like 10 minutes every single episode and having to skip stuff through. And so we would like to stay away from that model. And the most ethical way that we know how to do that is by going down the crowdfunded route. All that means is that people who have the means and the desire to do so can support our project so that it can continue to be free for everyone who consumes it. And it's crazy to see like where this podcast gets listened to. It's just incredible to see like people all around the world listening in, and we're just so chuffed that we get to do this. We're chuffed we get to provide, you know, educational content like today's episode for free. And so we're so appreciative to our patrons, to the people that make that possible. So yeah, patreon.com/mental health podcast is where you can do that. And other than that, I encourage you to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening to it, so that you can check out the 3rd episode when it drops next week. Oh, sorry, I should have said, if you're part of the Patreon, you can get access to all 4 right away, just as a little added bonus, just as a way for us to say thank you. But yeah, other than that, hope you have a great rest of your week, and really look forward to catching you next time. Cheers.